I was repairing a broken mantel clock when the hospital called to ask if my mother had dementia. Not might, not possibly, had. The nurse sounded exhausted in the way only night shift nurses do when they've already carried too many sad stories before midnight. They'd found my mother wandering near the harbor in freezing rain wearing bedroom slippers and a wool coat thrown over her nightgown. She'd been clutching an old music box so tightly they'd needed two nurses to pry her fingers loose. My sister Vanessa was supposed to be with her that week, but Vanessa hadn't answered her phone for nearly 6 hours. I remember driving through the fog toward Baxter Pier with my windshield wipers scraping uselessly against freezing rain while my hands shook so hard I almost missed the marina turn. And when I finally found my mother, sitting under the fluorescent lights of the emergency room, soaked through and staring blankly at the floor, she looked up at me with frightened eyes and whispered, "Where's Vanessa? She gets scared when I'm alone." Not Naomi, thank God. Not I was looking for you, just Vanessa. That was the moment I realized something I would spend the next year trying to survive. I was always the daughter who came when everything fell apart. I just wasn't the daughter anyone reached for first. My repair shop sat between a bait store and a used bookstore near the harbor, squeezed into a narrow brick building that smelled permanently of seawater and machine oil. Most evenings, the fog rolled in so thick the entire street looked like it had been erased halfway through existence. I liked it that way. Old clocks made more sense to me than people did. A broken clock usually failed for a reason: a cracked spring, rusted gears, neglect. Time damaged things honestly. Families were different. Families broke quietly. The mantel clock still sat open on my workbench the next morning when I returned from the hospital after barely 2 hours of sleep. Tiny brass gears glinted beneath the yellow lamp while cold harbor light leaked through the front windows. 3 clocks in the shop had stopped overnight. Oddly enough, all three had frozen during storms. I noticed things like that. I always noticed things nobody else had time for. I reheated stale coffee in the microwave behind the counter and accidentally burned it because I got distracted listening to another voicemail from the hospital reminding me to schedule neurological testing for my mother. I hadn't even processed the word dementia yet. My mother had been forgetting things for months, maybe longer, repeating stories, losing grocery lists, forgetting appointments. But people forget things when they get older. That's what I kept telling myself. Because once you admit something is truly wrong, your life changes shape around it. And deep down, I think I already knew mine had. By noon, Vanessa still hadn't shown up. She finally called while I was adjusting the pendulum on an antique wall clock. "Oh my God, Naomi, I feel terrible," she said quickly. "My phone died, and then Melissa dragged me out for her birthday thing, and you didn't hear the hospital messages?" Silence, then a sigh. I said I feel bad. Vanessa always sounded exhausted by responsibility before she'd even touched it. I closed my eyes. Moments like that used to make me angry when I was younger. But after enough years, anger turns into something quieter, something heavier. Accommodation. "Mom's home now," I said softly. "Oh good." Immediate relief flooded her voice. Was she upset? She thought it was 2004. Another pause. "Well," Vanessa laughed nervously, "at least she picked a good year." I stared out at the gray harbor while cold wind rattled the shop windows. "You're still staying with her tonight, right?" she asked. Of course I was. Vanessa already knew the answer before asking. After we hung up, I locked the shop early and drove to my mother's house along the waterfront road, lined with skeletal trees bending in the wind. The house looked smaller lately, tired. The porch railing leaned slightly to one side from storm damage nobody had fixed yet. Dead plants sat frozen in ceramic pots as the front steps. Inside smelled like dust, tea bags, and old sheet music. My mother sat at the piano wearing two different socks. "Oh, good," she said brightly when I walked in. "You're home from school early." I was 32 years old. "I am," I answered anyway. Correcting her constantly only upset her now. She smiled vaguely and returned to flipping through piano sheets she no longer remembered how to play properly. While she hummed softly to herself, I moved through the kitchen organizing medication bottles and overdue bills stacked near the toaster. Heating notice, medical invoice, past due reminder. My stomach tightened. Then I noticed several envelopes shoved deep inside the junk drawer beneath rubber bands and takeout menus. Bank paperwork, and financing documents. I frowned immediately. The family house had already been paid off years ago. I sat at the kitchen table while the old wall clock ticked unevenly overhead, and slowly flipped through page after page filled with signatures. My mother's handwriting looked shaky. Vanessa's signature appeared everywhere. Loan extensions, collateral agreements, payment restructuring. A cold feeling spread through my chest. From the living room, my mother suddenly called out, "Naomi, did your father leave already?" I swallowed hard. Dad had left 23 years earlier. "Yes," I answered quietly, "a while ago." She accepted that without question. That somehow hurt worse. Outside, wind slammed against the harbor windows hard enough to rattle the glass. I stared back down at the paperwork in my hands, then I saw the balance due. My pulse stumbled. For the first time, it occurred to me that Vanessa might not just be avoiding responsibility anymore. She might already be sacrificing pieces of our family just to escape carrying any herself. I started sleeping on my mother's couch 3 nights after finding the refinancing paperwork because I stopped trusting silence in that house. Silence usually meant she'd wandered somewhere, or turned the stove on, or opened the front door at 3 in the morning because she thought she heard my father's truck pulling into the driveway again. The couch springs dug into my back every night, but after a while exhaustion became stronger than discomfort. At 4:30 one morning, I woke to the smell of something burning. I ran into the kitchen barefoot and found 2 slices of blackened toast smoking inside the toaster while my mother stood beside the sink, staring blankly at the window. "Mom?" She jumped slightly. "Oh," she said softly. "I was making breakfast for the girls before school, the girls, meaning Vanessa and me. Except we were grown women now, and one of us wasn't there." I unplugged the toaster and opened the window while freezing harbor air rushed into the kitchen. Mom rubbed her forehead slowly. "I can't seem to keep the days straight anymore." The honesty in her voice scared me more than the confusion itself. Because somewhere underneath all the forgetting, she knew something was happening to her mind. And that meant she was frightened too. I spent that entire morning labeling drawers with masking tape. Plates, medications, towels. I taped emergency numbers beside the phone and programmed reminder alarms into her microwave-like clock because she no longer trusted herself to remember what time she'd taken her pills. By noon, I'd already missed 2 customer calls from the repair shop. One voicemail ended with, "If the clock isn't done by Friday, I'll just take my business somewhere else." I apologized out loud to an empty kitchen, like it was somehow my fault time itself had started collapsing around me. That became my routine, apologizing for things nobody else wanted to carry. Most evenings I brought unfinished repair work back to the house and spread tiny gears and springs across the dining room table while Mom slept in her recliner beside the television. Sometimes she'd wake suddenly and ask the same question 4 times within 10 minutes. "Did Vanessa call?" "Not yet." "Oh, that's 20 seconds later. Did Vanessa say when she's coming by?" I always answered gently. I never asked why she wasn't asking for me instead. Vanessa still technically shared caregiving responsibility. Technically. In reality, every emergency somehow drifted toward me like debris floating back to shore. One afternoon she canceled again because of a terrible anxiety day. Another time it was car trouble. Then a migraine. Then work stress. There was always something, and somehow I always understood, or at least pretended to. Around 2 in the morning one Thursday, I was scrubbing urine out of the hallway carpet after Mom got confused, trying to find the bathroom when my phone buzzed. Vanessa had posted pictures online from a waterfront brunch 30 miles away. Mimosas, Lobster Benedict, perfect makeup, bright smile. Caption, much needed reset day. I stared at the screen while carpet cleaner soaked through my jeans. Then I locked my phone and kept scrubbing, because anger required an energy I no longer had. The hardest part wasn't even the work. It was how differently my mother looked at Vanessa whenever she actually showed up. One Saturday afternoon, Vanessa arrived carrying expensive pastries and fresh flowers like a daughter in a pharmaceutical commercial. Mom's entire face lit up. "There's my sweet girl," she said immediately. Sweet girl. I stood 3 feet away cleaning spilled tea from the coffee table while Vanessa kissed Mom's cheek dramatically and apologized for being so busy lately. Mom barely noticed me. Later that evening, after Vanessa left, I helped Mom into bed while she blinked at me sleepily. "Thank you, Sandra." I froze. Sandra had been the part-time home aide we hired briefly the previous summer. "It's Naomi," I whispered gently. "Oh," she looked embarrassed. "Of course it is." Then she fell asleep before I could recover from the feeling of being erased inside my own childhood home. The next morning, Mrs. Delaney from next door stopped me while I was unloading groceries. "You're such a blessing to your mother," she said warmly. I forced a smile. People kept calling me strong like it was a compliment. But after a while, strong starts sounding suspiciously close to alone. A few nights later, I fell asleep sitting in my car, outside the pharmacy waiting for Mom's prescription refill. I woke to someone's tapping lightly against the window. Graham Pierce stood outside holding 2 paper coffee cups. "You left your headlights on," he said when I rolled the window down. I looked around, disoriented. The pharmacy parking lot was nearly empty except for his harbor maintenance truck parked nearby. "What time is it?" "Almost midnight." My neck ached from sleeping upright. "That bad, huh?" he asked gently. I laughed weakly. I think I forgot what normal tired feels like. He handed me one of the coffees without making a big deal out of it. No pity, no advice, just coffee. That almost made me cry for some reason. His daughter Mia started stopping by the repair shop after school around that time too, mostly to do homework in the corner while I worked. One afternoon, she picked up a broken pocket watch from my counter. "Why do so many clocks stop during storms?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. She studied me for a second. "Do you ever fix things people should've taken care of sooner?" The question landed harder than she probably intended. That same evening, while organizing Mom's paperwork again, I noticed several cash withdrawals from accounts I didn't recognize. Large amounts. Too large. There were also overdue mortgage notices hidden beneath old piano sheets, and an appointment card for an estate attorney tucked inside the piano bench. The date on the card was nearly 8 months old. When I asked Mom about it over dinner, her expression changed instantly. "Oh, Vanessa handled all that. What exactly did she handle?" Mom suddenly looked nervous. "I don't remember." Then quietly, she said not to worry you. That night, after Mom finally fell asleep, I stepped onto the back porch for air. The harbor fog had rolled in thick enough to erase the water completely. I heard Vanessa's voice before I realized she was standing near the side gate talking on her phone. "She likes taking care of people," she said with a small laugh. "Honestly, it gives Naomi purpose." Something inside me went very still, not angry, not shocked, just tired in a deeper way than before, because I realized then that my sacrifice had slowly become everyone else's convenience. The storm started just after sunset. By 8 o'clock, rain slammed against the harbor windows hard enough to shake the old glass in their frames, and the power flickered every few minutes like the house itself was struggling to stay awake. My mother hated storms now. They confused her. Darkness made time disappear completely inside her mind. She stood near the piano, twisting the sleeve of her cardigan anxiously while thunder rolled across the water. "We're late," she kept saying. "Vanessa's waiting for me after dance practice." "Mom, it's okay," I said softly from the kitchen while resetting the breaker after another outage. "Vanessa's home." But logic no longer reached her the way it used to. She moved toward the hallway in panic. "We can't leave her there alone." the lights blinked once, twice, then everything went black. I cursed quietly and grabbed the flashlight from the junk drawer before heading downstairs toward the fuse box. The entire house groaned under the wind. It couldn't have taken more than 2 minutes, maybe less. But when I came back upstairs, the flashlight beam landed on my mother crumpled beside the staircase. For one terrible second, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. Then I saw the blood. Mom. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the floorboards. She had fallen against the edge of the piano bench. Her glasses lay several feet away beside the wall clock that had stopped ticking entirely. I dropped to my knees so fast pain shot through my legs. Mom, stay with me. Her breathing sounded wrong. Wet, shallow. She blinked slowly toward my voice, confused and frightened. Then something happened that shattered me more than the blood did. She reached for my hand, not Vanessa's, mine. Naomi, she whispered weakly. It was the first time in months she'd said my name without hesitation. I called 911 with shaking hands while pressing a towel against her head wound. Outside, the storm kept roaring like none of this mattered. At the hospital, everything smelled like antiseptic, wet wool coats, and burnt coffee. The emergency room was overcrowded because half the town had apparently lost power or crashed cars on icy roads. I sat beside my mother's stretcher, soaked from the rain while nurses rushed around us speaking in calm voices that somehow made everything feel scarier. One doctor pulled me aside near the vending machines. Has your mother been formally diagnosed with cognitive decline yet? The question landed like accusation. No, I admitted quietly. He nodded gently, but I still felt ashamed, as if I'd failed some invisible test. Vanessa didn't arrive until nearly 3 hours later. She burst into the waiting room crying before she even reached us. Oh my God, is she okay? People immediately moved toward her. A nurse touched her shoulder. Someone offered tissues. Meanwhile, I sat in the corner filling out insurance paperwork with blood still dried across my sweater sleeve. That was the thing about visible emotions. People rushed to comfort them. Functional women just got handed more forms. Vanessa hugged me tightly. I came as fast as I could. I nodded because I no longer had energy for conflict. But later, while walking back from the bathroom, I overheard her whispering angrily into her phone near the vending machines. No, I told you I need more time. Pause. I can't deal with this tonight. Her voice sounded sharp. Panicked. The moment she noticed me standing there, she hung up immediately. What? Nothing, I said automatically. Nothing. That word had become my entire personality. Mom was moved into ICU just before dawn after scans showed swelling around her brain. I spent the next 3 days sleeping upright in a plastic chair beside her bed while machines beeped softly through the night. My contacts dried against my eyes, my neck locked from exhaustion. Hospital disinfectant clung to my clothes and hair until I couldn't smell anything else anymore. Sometimes Mom woke for a few minutes at a time, long enough to become frightened again, long enough to try saying things she couldn't fully finish. The house, she whispered once. I leaned closer. What about the house? Her eyes moved toward the doorway anxiously. Vanessa. I didn't. Then medication pulled her back under before she finished. The unfinished sentence haunted me. On the second night, a hospital social worker quietly asked if my mother had ever seemed pressured about financial decisions recently. I stared at her. Why would you ask that? She hesitated carefully. Sometimes cognitive decline makes older patients vulnerable. Vulnerable. The word made my stomach turn. That evening, Graham appeared outside the ICU carrying 2 coffees and a folded sweater. You've worn the same clothes for 2 days, he said simply. I almost argued out of habit. Instead, I took the sweater. Thank you. He sat beside me without asking questions. No forced optimism, no speeches, just quiet company. Later, Mia dropped off a handwritten note at the nurse's station for me before school. People get tired when they carry everything alone. I stared at the sentence for a long time after she left, because nobody in my family had ever said anything remotely like that to me before. 3 mornings later, the storm finally passed. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds while I held my mother's hand beside the bed. Her breathing slowed gradually, peacefully, almost gently. Vanessa had fallen asleep curled in a waiting room chair sometime before dawn, so when my mother died, it was just me there, me, the daughter who stayed. I felt grief hit first, then relief immediately afterward, and the relief horrified me more than the grief itself. At the funeral, people kept squeezing my hands and telling me how devoted I'd been. You were such a blessing to her. She depended on you so much. You're incredibly strong. Every compliment felt like another brick being quietly stacked onto my spine. Vanessa cried openly through the service, and people gathered around her constantly. I stood beside the flowers numb enough to barely hear the pastor speaking. After the burial, the family attorney approached me before I'd even reached my car. Naomi, he said carefully, there are urgent estate matters we need to discuss. The will reading happened the next afternoon inside a small law office overlooking the frozen harbor. I already knew the house would probably be divided between Vanessa and me. What I didn't know was how much damage had already been done. The attorney adjusted his glasses nervously while flipping through paperwork. There are substantial debts attached to the property, he explained. Vanessa went pale immediately. My chest tightened. What kind of debts? Refinancing agreements, secondary collateral loans, missed payments. I slowly turned toward my sister. You borrowed against the house? It wasn't supposed to get this bad, she whispered. The room suddenly felt too small to breathe inside. There may also be concerns, the attorney added carefully, about whether Eleanor fully understood certain documents she signed during the progression of her illness. I looked down at the shaky signatures spread across the table. My mother's name barely looked like her own anymore. Outside the office afterward, icy wind rolled off the harbor while Vanessa cried beside the sidewalk. I thought we'd figure it out eventually, she said desperately. You always figure things out. And there it was, the truth, not hidden inside paperwork, not buried in legal language, inside expectation. Everyone had spent so many years believing I could carry anything. They never stopped to ask what it was costing me. The house became unbearably quiet after the funeral. Not peaceful, quiet in the way abandoned churches feel quiet. Every room still carried evidence of my mother's routines, but the routines themselves had vanished. Her reading glasses remained folded beside the recliner. Half-finished crossword puzzles still covered the kitchen table. One of her cardigans hung over the banister, exactly where she'd left it before the storm. But there were no footsteps anymore. No confused questions drifting down the hallway at 2 in the morning. No medicine alarms vibrating against countertops. The first week after her death, I kept waking automatically before dawn, thinking I'd forgotten to check on her. One morning, I actually walked halfway to her bedroom carrying a glass of water before I remembered there was nobody inside. I stood there in the dark hallway staring at the closed door while grief hit me so suddenly I had to grip the wall to stay upright. Then came the guilt. Because underneath the grief, there was relief too. No more panic every time the phone rang. No more sleeping with one ear open. No more fear she'd wander into freezing weather again. Relief felt monstrous, like betrayal disguised as exhaustion. I started spending entire days sorting through the house. It's mostly because standing still made my thoughts louder. Dust floated through weak winter sunlight while old clocks ticked unevenly from every room. The house smelled faintly of cedar, cold air, and sheet music. Every drawer held another version of our family frozen in time. Receipts, birthday cards, old piano recital programs. I found one photo album where nearly every picture centered around Vanessa. Vanessa dancing, Vanessa smiling, Vanessa blowing out birthday candles. I appeared mostly in backgrounds, holding coats, setting tables, watching. I closed the album quickly after that. One afternoon, while sorting the upstairs linen closet, I realized several pieces of my mother's jewelry were missing. Not expensive pieces, but meaningful ones. Her pearl earrings, Grandma's silver bracelet, the sapphire ring she wore every Christmas. At first, I convinced myself they were misplaced. That's what I always did, turn missing things into misunderstandings. Outside, harbor wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the old pipes groan. I found more overdue notices beneath the table runners in the dining room buffet. Heating bills, tax warnings, collection letters, and every time I called Vanessa, it went straight to voicemail. 3 days later, Graham by to repair the storm damage on the back porch railing. I almost told him not to bother. Then I realized I'd started refusing help automatically before anyone even offered it. He worked quietly while I sorted boxes nearby. No unnecessary conversation. No awkward sympathy. Around noon, he handed me a container of chowder from the diner near the marina. "You forgot lunch again," he said. I blinked at him. "How did you know?" "You've been standing in the same spot holding that box for 20 minutes. I looked down and realized he was right. My body felt permanently exhausted now, like grief itself had weight. We sat on the porch steps, eating in silence, while gulls cried somewhere beyond the fog. "You don't have to fix everything immediately," Graham said finally. I almost laughed. That sentence sounded impossible to me. Because fixing things was the only reason people ever kept me around. Later that week, I found my mother's journals hidden inside the piano bench beneath stacks of old sheet music. At first, I thought they might explain the refinancing paperwork. Instead, they explained us. The earliest entries were from when Vanessa was 9 years old and spent months in and out of hospitals with a severe respiratory illness. I barely remembered most of it. But apparently my mother never emotionally recovered from the fear of losing her. Vanessa is still so fragile. I read the sentence 3 separate times. Few pages later, Naomi understands when I'm busy with Vanessa. Then, Naomi is such an easy child, easy child. The phrase sat against my chest like a stone. Page after page painted the same picture. My mother loved me, I could see that clearly now, but she trusted my survival more than Vanessa's. And somewhere along the way, that trust quietly became neglect. Not intentional cruelty, something sadder, habit. One journal entry stopped me completely. Sometimes I worry Naomi disappears inside responsibility. She apologizes even when she's hurting. My throat tightened because she had noticed. She had seen it, she just never stopped it. A later page had been ripped out entirely near several mentions of finances and the house. I stared at the torn edge for a long time. That night, Vanessa finally showed up. She looked exhausted, mascara smeared, hair unwashed, hands shaking slightly as she poured herself wine without asking. "They're calling constantly now," she muttered. "Who? Collectors, lawyers, everybody." I leaned against the kitchen counter watching her carefully. "How much debt are we talking about, Vanessa?" She avoided my eyes. "It got complicated. That's not a number." She slammed the wine glass down too hard. "You think I wanted this?" "No," I said quietly. "I think you thought somebody else would clean it up eventually." The silence afterward felt sharp enough to cut through skin. Vanessa's face crumpled. "I was drowning. And Mom?" That landed. I saw it physically land inside her chest. "She knew about some of it," Vanessa whispered finally. "Not everything, but some." The room suddenly felt colder. She signed papers while she barely knew what year it was. "She wanted to help me. She trusted you." Vanessa started crying then, but for the first time in my life, her tears didn't automatically erase my anger. Because something inside me had finally become too exhausted to keep translating everyone else's damage into excuses. After she left, I climbed into the attic, searching for more financial paperwork. Instead, I found a small sewing tin buried beneath old blankets. Inside was a cassette tape labeled in my mother's handwriting, for my girls. My hands went cold immediately. I carried it downstairs to the living room, where the old tape player still sat beneath the bookshelf. The tape crackled violently when I pressed play. Then my mother's voice appeared briefly through the static. "If you're hearing this, there are things I should have said sooner." The recording warped suddenly into distortion before cutting out completely. I sat there staring at the machine while snow drifted silently past the harbor windows. A voicemail notification buzzed across my phone. Foreclosure attorney. Urgent deadline regarding property seizure proceedings. I closed my eyes slowly. For years, I had nearly destroyed myself trying to protect that house because I thought saving it meant saving my family. But sitting there alone in the silence afterward, I realized something terrifying. I no longer knew whether the house had ever protected me back. The next morning, I carried the damaged cassette tape to my repair shop before sunrise, like it was something fragile enough to break me open completely. The harbor was still dark when I unlocked the front door. Inside, the familiar smell of brass polish and old wood wrapped around me immediately. Clocks ticked softly from every wall, while pale blue dawn slowly crept through the front windows. For years, this place had been the only room in my life that felt predictable. Broken things came in. I repaired them. They left working again. People were harder. I spent nearly 2 hours carefully cleaning the cassette reels using restoration tools meant for antique mechanisms. Tiny, steady movements, precise pressure, patience. The same skills I'd used my entire life trying to keep everyone else functional. Around 8 in the morning, I finally slid the tape back into the old player behind the counter. Static crackled through the speakers. Then my mother's voice returned, older than I remembered, more tired. "If you're hearing this," she said softly, "then I probably waited too long to say these things." I sat completely still. "I know I leaned on you too much, Naomi." My throat tightened instantly. In my mind, I kept telling myself you were stronger, more capable, easier. I thought trusting you to handle hard things meant I believed in you. The tape hissed briefly. "But sometimes I wonder if I confused your silence for strength." I pressed my hand over my mouth. Outside, snow drifted slowly across the harbor street. Inside the tape, my mother took a shaky breath. "I worried about Vanessa surviving disappointment, but I worried about you disappearing inside responsibility." That sentence cracked something open in me I hadn't realized was still holding, because she had seen me. Not fully, not enough to stop it, but she had seen me. And somehow that hurt almost more than being invisible. "I'm sorry," she whispered through static, "for every time being dependable cost you something nobody noticed." The recording warped again after that, fading into distorted noise before stopping completely. I sat alone in the shop staring at nothing while tears slid silently down my face. Not dramatic sobbing, just exhaustion finally finding somewhere to go. I thought about every moment people had praised me for being easy, easy child, easy daughter, easy sister. What they really meant was convenient. The bell above the shop door startled me around noon. Vanessa walked in looking like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. Dark circles hollowed beneath her eyes. Her expensive winter coat looked wrinkled and carelessly thrown on. For the first time in my life, she didn't look like the beautiful sister everybody instinctively protected. She looked scared. "They're threatening legal action now," she said before I could speak. "No hello, no easing into conversation, just fear." I quietly turned the closed sign on the front door. Vanessa noticed the tape player still sitting on the counter. "What's that?" Mom left a recording. Something flickered across her face. Guilt, maybe. Or grief. I didn't know she made one. Neither did I. Vanessa sank heavily into the chair beside the workbench and rubbed both hands over her face. "I messed everything up." Part of me expected my old instinct to activate immediately, comfort her, fix it, carry it. Instead, I just waited. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, she whispered, "I really thought I'd figured things out before anybody found out how bad it got. How bad is it?" She gave a weak laugh. "I don't even know anymore." That was the first honest thing she'd said in months, maybe years. Snow tapped softly against the windows while clocks ticked around us like tiny mechanical heartbeats. "I used the house because the bank wouldn't approve anything otherwise," she admitted quietly. And every time I thought I was close to fixing things, something else happened. You forged Mom's trust. Her eyes filled immediately. I know. No, I said softly, I don't think you do. Vanessa looked up at me then with genuine confusion. You've spent your whole life assuming someone else would survive the consequences for you. That landed harder than yelling would have, because it was true. She stared down at her hands. You were always stronger than me. There it is again. What? I shook my head slowly. That thing everybody says like it's kindness. Vanessa looked suddenly smaller somehow. When I got sick as a kid, she said quietly, Mom watched me constantly. Dad panicked every time I coughed. Everybody treated me like something fragile that could disappear. I stayed silent. But you, her voice cracked slightly, you always seemed okay. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Nobody had ever asked whether I was okay. They'd only noticed whether I was functioning. You know what Mom said about me in her journals? I asked quietly. Vanessa swallowed hard. She called me easy. Pain flickered across her face immediately. I'm sorry. I don't think you ever saw me at all, I whispered. Neither of us spoke after that. The harbor fog had started rolling back in outside, swallowing the street little by little. Finally, Vanessa asked the question I think she came there for all along. Can you help me fix this? The old version of me almost answered automatically. Of course, I'll figure it out. Don't worry, I could actually feel the reflex rise inside my chest. Then I remembered my mother's voice saying, I worried about you disappearing inside responsibility, and suddenly I saw my entire life clearly. Every sacrifice, every excuse, every swallowed resentment. I looked at my sister for a long moment. Then I said the word that had terrified me my entire adulthood. No. Vanessa blinked like she genuinely didn't understand what she'd heard. I'll help you find legal aid, I said carefully. I'll give you numbers to call, but I'm not sacrificing my savings or my future to clean this up anymore. Tears filled her eyes instantly. You'd really let me drown? The question almost pulled me backward into guilt again. Almost. But something inside me had changed. No, I said softly. I'm finally letting you swim for yourself. She cried openly then, and for once I didn't rush to stop it. Because pain wasn't always an emergency. Sometimes it was accountability arriving. That night after Vanessa left, I returned to the family house alone and walked slowly through each room. Without my mother there, the place no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum dedicated to emotional obligation. I stood in the attic packing boxes when I found an old childhood drawing folded between books. Stick figures, crayon clocks, a crooked little house. At the bottom, in childish handwriting, were the words, Naomi fixes things so nobody leaves. I stared at the paper so long my vision blurred. Even as a little girl, I had already believed love depended on usefulness. My phone buzzed just after midnight. Vanessa, crying. Sitting outside the house after another confrontation with creditors. For one dangerous moment, I almost opened the front door and stepped back into the role that had consumed my entire life. Then I stopped. Instead, I walked outside, handed her the phone number for a legal counselor written on scrap paper, and quietly said, You need help I can't give you anymore. I went back inside before she could answer, and as I locked the door behind me, I realized something both terrifying and freeing at the same time. Being needed had never been the same thing as being loved. By the time autumn returned to the harbor, I had stopped waking up afraid of the phone. That was how I knew my life had actually changed. Not because everything was magically healed, not because grief disappeared, but because my body no longer lived in constant anticipation of someone else's crisis. The old family house sold at the end of summer after months of legal negotiations and debt settlements. Watching strangers carry furniture through the front door should have devastated me. Instead, I mostly felt tired and strangely light, like I had finally set down something I'd been carrying so long I forgot it was heavy. I moved my repair shop 3 blocks closer to the marina into a larger storefront connected to a small independent bookstore cafe. The owner offered me the extra space after hearing I was losing access to the old workshop attached to the house basement. Now my mornings smelled like espresso, old paperbacks, cinnamon pastries, and machine oil. It felt warmer than my old life, softer somehow. Children wandered through the bookstore after school, while tourists drifted in from the harbor, looking for coffee and somewhere quiet to sit. Sometimes people brought clocks into the shop, just because they liked talking to someone patient enough to repair old things carefully. For the first time in years, my days belonged to me. That realization took longer to get used to than I expected. Some mornings I still woke suddenly at 5 o'clock, convinced I'd forgotten medication schedules or doctor appointments. Sometimes I still reached for my phone expecting disaster. Healing, I learned, wasn't dramatic. It was repetition. Stave days repeated enough times that your nervous system slowly believed them. One afternoon, I caught myself laughing at something in Syed while we reorganized the children's reading corner beside the cafe windows. The sound startled me, not because I never laughed before, but because it came out easily, without guilt attached to it. Mia balanced on a stool taping paper pumpkins along the bookshelf, while I repaired an old school clock for a community fundraiser. "You smile more now," she said casually. I looked up from the clock mechanism. "What?" She shrugged. "You used to look like somebody bracing for bad news all the time." Kids notice everything adults try to hide. I smiled faintly. "Do I still? Sometimes." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "But not every second anymore." That stayed with me longer than she probably realized. Graham walked in around noon carrying sandwiches from the diner near the docks. No dramatic entrance, no performance, just consistency. That was what I loved most about him eventually. Not excitement, not rescue steadiness. For a long time, steady felt suspicious to me. I kept waiting for hidden disappointment underneath kindness, because chaos had trained my nervous system to mistake unpredictability for love. But Graham never demanded emotional proof from me. If I had a hard day, he listened. If I needed silence, he respected it. If I forgot to eat while working, he simply placed food beside me without turning care into obligation. Safe love, it turned out, was much quieter than the kind I grew up around. Late October brought the first cold wind off the harbor. I was adjusting the hands on an antique railway clock when the bell above the front door rang softly. Vanessa stepped inside. For a second, neither of us spoke. She looked different. Not glamorous anymore, real. Her hair was shorter now, less carefully styled. Dark circles still lingered beneath her eyes, but there was something steadier in her posture than before. "I almost didn't come in," she admitted quietly. "I set the screwdriver down carefully. How are you?" She gave a small laugh. "Honestly, some days awful, some days better." She had filed bankruptcy 3 months earlier, started therapy shortly after that, found consistent office work with a shipping company outside town. For the first time in her life, nobody was rescuing her financially. And somehow, she looked more solid because of it. Mia quietly disappeared into the cafe area, sensing adult conversation approaching. Vanessa looked around the shop slowly. "You built something really beautiful here." The old version of me would have immediately downplayed the compliment. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you." That was healing too. Accepting kindness without apologizing for it. Vanessa stepped closer to the workbench. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom lately." I nodded but stayed quiet. "She loved you," Vanessa whispered. "I know it probably never felt balanced, but she did." A strange ache moved through me hearing that, not because I doubted it anymore, but because love and damage had existed together in our family. For so long, neither of us knew how to separate them cleanly. Vanessa's eyes filled slowly. "I think everyone loved you for what you carried," she said softly. "And after a while, we forgot you were carrying it alone." Something inside me loosened hearing those words. Not fixed, not erased, just acknowledged. And sometimes acknowledgement heals wounds anger never could. "I used to think if I stopped holding everything together," I admitted quietly, "people would leave." Vanessa looked down. Maybe we already did, she whispered. The honesty of that nearly broke me, but not in the old way, not like abandonment. More like truth finally entering a room that had been dark for years. Before leaving, Vanessa hugged me tightly. Not desperately, not asking for rescue, just sister to sister. And for the first time in our lives, I didn't feel responsible for managing her emotions afterward. That night, after closing the shop, I stayed behind, repairing one final clock beneath the warm glow of the workbench lamp. An elderly customer had brought it in earlier that week. The mechanism stopped in the exact year my father left us, 1998. I carefully cleaned each damaged gear while cafe lights glowed softly through the doorway behind me. Mia had fallen asleep over homework at one of the tables. Graham stood near the bookshelf, tightening loose screws quietly to avoid waking her. And suddenly I realized something that would have terrified the younger version of me. Peace no longer felt empty. It felt safe. When the clock finally started ticking again, the sound filled the shop softly like a heartbeat returning. I sat there listening to it for a long time. For most of my life, I believed love meant proving I could survive pain without complaining. I thought if I stayed patient enough, helpful enough, forgiving enough, someone would finally choose me first. But love was never supposed to feel like disappearing. And maybe healing begins the moment you stop asking how much of yourself you must sacrifice just to deserve being stayed for. Outside, harbor lights reflected across dark quart while autumn wind rattled the bookstore windows gently. Inside, warm life continued around me without guilt, without chaos, without fear. And for the first time I could remember, I wasn't waiting for something to fall apart. If you've ever been the person in your family who carried everything quietly while everyone else got forgiven first, I hope you remember this. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. And if this story stayed with you tonight, tell me in the comments which moment hurt you the most or which part felt the most familiar. Don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who spent too many years surviving for everybody else, and subscribe to the channel if you want more stories about family, betrayal, healing in women, and finally learning they don't have to disappear to deserve love.